can you go ahead and start?
So tell me when to.
Okay, I think we're starting now.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Craig Knobloch. Welcome to the webinar in our series on digital technologies for COVID-19. We have two speakers today. Our first speaker is Pedro Szekely, and Pedro is a principal scientist here at the Information Science Institute at USC. He's also director of the Center on Knowledge Graphs here, which is a large center with about 40 or 50 people, including students. And he's a research associate professor in computer science. So Pedro has done a tremendous amount of work on this sort of general topic in terms of building knowledge graphs. He's interested in sort of all the various techniques used to build these things. And he's done a lot of work that's been applied to a number of real world applications. So for example, he's worked on one particular application, which is combating human trafficking, as well as things like cybersecurity and other types of things. And so I think his work has had a big impact over the years. And so he's going to tell us about some of his current work on applying knowledge graphs to COVID-19. So let me turn it over to Pedro.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Craig. Thanks for the introduction, and happy to have the opportunity to talk about the work that we're doing on knowledge graphs for COVID-19. So let me share my screen. And put this in presenter mode. So are my slides visible, Craig? Just to confirm.
Yes, they are. Yeah, I can see your slides.
Okay. So yeah, I'm Pedro Szekely, and whoops, what happened? Okay. This work draws on work that has been done by many folks at the Center on Knowledge Graphs. We have many researchers, staff, PhD students, and master students. So let me tell you there's a background for this work. The Allen Institute for AI released this data set of scientific articles about COVID-19. It's the COVID-19 corpus. And it's a free resource that they have made available to the research community. And so the question that we're asking is, so can AI make these papers more useful to researchers? Because reading 20,000 papers is really not so much fun. So the idea is to use machine reading to distill knowledge from the articles. And so in this chart, you see a paper, and we give it to the machine reading. And the idea is to extract various kinds of entities and events that are sort of relevant for researchers in bioinformatics, and then put the information in a knowledge graph so that it's easy to use and easy to write applications and new analytics. And so just a one chart introduction about what is a knowledge graph. So a knowledge graph represents knowledge with nodes and edges. And the nodes often are used to represent entities, and the edges represent relationships between the entities or attributes of the entities, like the date of birth of Harry Truman is there. And you see in the position held part here that one can also have edges about edges, so that one can qualify, for example, to say that the position held that Harry Truman was president between those two times. And we're leveraging a very large knowledge graph that exists publicly available, called Wikidata, that has 83 million items already. It's crowdsourced and it's free for everybody to use. It turns out Wikidata has a lot of bioinformatics data. So the table on the left has some statistics. There are over 30 million scholarly articles. Many genes, chemicals, proteins, drugs, diseases are recorded in Wikidata. It's not complete, but it is a very good starting point. And so here you see a screenshot of a scientific article present in Wikidata. So it has all the basic metadata, the citations, and then identifiers of where to find the original content of the paper. Similarly, here's a screenshot of a protein, estrogen receptor 1. And one of the nice things is it has many of the identifiers that are used in external databases for this protein, and then links to many other entities that are relevant to this protein, or what interacts with biological processes, molecular function, cell component, and so on. And so it's very nice to leverage this resource so that when we apply machine reading to a paper, we can basically link the entities to the entities that already exist in Wikidata, and then have a very rich representation of what is the paper talking about. And so this is the pipeline at a very high level. We take the text of the article, it goes through a machine reading component, it extracts entities and events, and then they get linked to Wikidata, and then we basically extend Wikidata with annotations on the papers that are about COVID-19. We're currently targeting 2 machine reading systems, but the idea is to be able to incorporate as many as we can get our hands on. And what we're doing is not actually running this machine reading systems. The folks who actually do these machine reading systems have been running them on the COVID-19 corpus, and we're getting the outputs. And one of the systems is from the Blender lab at UIUC, led by Hong Ji. And the other one is a very famous system in the community called Reach. And you can see an example here of the kinds of complex relationships that it can extract from the text. And so the idea is to put all this in an easy to use knowledge graph. Now the challenge is that the output of this machine reading systems is very complicated. And I don't expect you to understand this. I don't actually understand it fully myself. But the folks who are working on integrating this data, so look at the documentation of these systems, or talk to the folks who did them, figure out what all these fields mean, and then we can align them to the ontologies. And what we want to be able to do is basically put all this information in a simple way so that people can use it much more easily than when it comes out of the machine reading systems. And part of the challenge is that each machine reading system has its own format. And so this is what we want to produce as an output. So we want to produce it as a TSV file. And so we have nodes that can represent, say, publications, and then they have edges to other nodes. So we have here an example, here's a node for this publication. It's an instance of a scholarly article, and it mentions the protein. This is the ID of the protein, and this is the name. And so the idea is we basically have a node, an edge, and another node. And for each of those elements, we provide an ID and some English label that people can read and understand what that row means. And all the information comes like this. We are also planning to make it available as RDF, which is of the semantic web standard for publishing knowledge graphs, which in my opinion is much less convenient than this of TSV file that we're proposing. And then we'll host it in Sparkle endpoints, which is also popular in the semantic web community, and Neo4j, which is very popular in sort of the business world. So the data model is very simple. So the edges in red represent what we are adding to represent the output of the machine reading systems. And so we have articles, and from Wikidata, they already have a place to put the title, the author, and so on. And we're adding these edges to represent what the machine reading systems can extract. And then these entities are also entities that already exist in Wikidata. In addition, for every edge that we add, we record justifications about where in the paper did this entity get extracted, what was the text fragment, where is it, what character does it start in, what was the actual text that appeared, and what software was used to extract it. And then we put in the knowledge graph, then we can ask interesting questions like this one. Show me the genes in articles that mention chloroquine and remdesivir. And we get an answer. There's this article, it mentions this, and it appeared on this date, and so on. So these are so very simple queries that you can already do once you put the information in the knowledge graph. And part of what we need help with from folks is to understand what are the questions that people would want to ask from this kind of knowledge graph. So here is another one where you can ask the same question, but also ask to see what section of the paper the extraction came from. Because maybe it's different when if a gene is mentioned in the results as opposed to the background or the references. So this kind of detail is also available in the knowledge graph. And so one can also construct visualizations that let you see the genes in the article. So we see that there are many genes, but some are mentioned much more often. This is so like the TNF and LXN, I don't actually know what those mean, but one can see those are mentioned much more often. And here on the bottom, I just included the Sparkle query that gets you this data and produces the visualization. So it's a fairly short query. Of course, it's not something that normal developers would know how to write, but this is something that we also want to know from folks. What are some of the templates for queries that would make sense to provide an easy to use interface. So this is another query I did, which is, what are the actual strings or texts that people use to mention to the coronavirus disease in this corpus? So, mostly referred as MERS-CoV infection, but these are some of the other names that people use to refer to the coronavirus disease. I also did some graph queries. So what are diseases mentioned in papers about chloroquine? So it has infection, neoplasm, diarrhea, kidney disease, So that was kind of interesting to see. I don't know what to make of it, but yeah, one can see the diseases, one can see the papers that mention it, and one can sort of get a sense of what is mentioned more often together with something, and then one could sort of go to the papers and so get to go read about them. So this is about the chemicals that get mentioned in papers about chloroquine. So chloroquine, of course, gets mentioned a lot, but there are other things like lopinavir and this ribavirin. So I don't, one can sort of start to see sort of interesting relationships that hopefully are sort of meaningful to people who sort of study these things. Also, which genes are mentioned, so one can see some hubs like LXN and TOR and so on that are also mentioned in these papers. So these are just illustrations of the kinds of queries that one can do once you have the knowledge graph. So we have a Sparkle endpoint, and so anyone who knows how to write Sparkle can come and write queries. So you see here the query that produces this visualization. We're also publishing our data set in our GitHub. It's not currently there, but it will be, a new version will be there very shortly. And it'll have all the TSV files that you'll have the sort of nicely curated outputs of the machine reading systems and the subset of Wikidata that they refer to. And so the next steps are to basically release all our data sets, deploy this Sparkle endpoint, so make it public, and then also deploy a Neo4j endpoint for folks who want to do that. We plan to integrate with Jay's knowledge graph. He's going to talk about it after me. And then, we've already done this Blender machine reading system. We're going to do Reach, and then we'll work with other folks to integrate other outputs. And then we know people are interested in embeddings of this graph so that they can use it with machine learning systems and all kinds of network analytics like PageRank and centrality measures and so on. And most importantly, what we really want to do is talk to end users about use cases so that we can understand, so what are the questions that people want to ask of this kind of knowledge graph, so that we can make sure that those questions are easy to ask, and we have the knowledge there that supports the answers. And so, that is the summary of what we're doing. So I'll stop sharing, and maybe people can ask some questions and offer us advice on some use cases that folks are interested in.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pedro. Okay, so we're going to take questions in the Q&A. So if people have questions, they can post them in the Q&A, and then I'll read the questions. So we already have a few posted already. So the first one, Pedro, is what are examples of machine reading systems applied today?
So the two ones that, so do I speak or do I type?
Oh, you speak.
Okay. Yeah, so the one that we are using currently is from Hengji's group at UIUC. And this is coming from a DARPA program, and they are interested in these outputs. And then we're also going to use the Reach project at University of Arizona, as they really have the state-of-the-art system for extracting information from bioinformatics papers.
Okay, great.
On slide 21, orange and green. So, okay.
Yeah, what does it mean? So.
Yeah, so the green are the papers, and the orange is, the other entity. So let me, so I quickly share again. Yeah, so like in this case, sorry, I should have said that. So the diseases are in orange. The papers are always in green, and those are the PubMed IDs. So this is saying, okay, neoplasm is being referred to by many of these papers. So in the next slide about chemicals, the papers are still in green, but now the chemicals are in orange. So I always chose the papers to be left in green, and whatever else I'm showing is in orange.
Okay, great. I don't think we have any more questions posted, but I have a question, Pedro, which is, can you talk about how people might actually use the knowledge graph for working with COVID papers or publications?
So what we envision two use cases. One is that they will actually download the knowledge graph in the sort of tab separated values form if they're interested in sort of doing their own analytics. And so that's one use case. The other one is that they would write Sparkle queries like this one that I wrote here, that basically gives me the sort of the genes and the papers and how they relate to each other. And what we plan to do when we release is to actually show some typical Sparkle queries that people can sort of start with and sort of modify for their use.
Okay, great. Okay, I have another question for you. So are there additional extractions from the COVID-19 dataset besides predefined class types, such as sections, genes, symptoms, etc.? For example, how hard would it be to extract the size or number of patients that were tested in different publications?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And I think, so there are two things. One is, Jay is going to talk about this type of extractions from the results of the paper. And then the other thing too that I want to show is the extractions from the Blender system, from the University of Arizona system. So they actually extract much more complicated relationships. So they know that this gene here is was subject to phosphorylation or something that was controlled by a regulation by this chemical. So it can actually formally represent these more complex relationships between the genes and what they caused and what the result was.
Okay, great. The next question is, how are graphs differentiating between genes and diseases?
Okay, yeah, so this is coming from Wikidata. So all the genes are instances of a gene class, and all the diseases are instances of a disease class. So when the information was imported from the different databases into Wikidata, they recorded it in this way so that they could keep track of what is what. And actually, I think for genes, they have a much more complex taxonomy where they can classify the genes into sort of different subclasses, and they use the sort of class hierarchy in the knowledge graph to sort of keep track of what is what.
Okay, great. I don't think we have any more questions, so I think we'll move on to our second speaker. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Gary Ramachandran, who's going to introduce our second speaker. Gary? I think you're still muted, Gary.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Professor. Jay, why don't you start setting up the presentation by sharing your screen? Right, folks. My name is Gauri Ramachandran. I'm a senior research associate at USC Viterbi Center for Cyber Physical Systems and the Internet of Things. So I'm going to moderate this second session. So our next speaker is Jay Pujara. So today Jay is going to present how knowledge graphs can be used to provide a rapid response to COVID-19. And Jay is a research associate professor of computer science at the University of Southern California, and he is also a research lead at the Information Sciences Institute. His principal area of research are machine learning, artificial intelligence, and data science. And prior to his PhD, Jay spent 6 years at Yahoo working on mail spam detection and user trust. And he has also worked at Google, LinkedIn, and Oracle. So I'll now invite Jay to start his presentation.
Thanks for the introduction, Gauri. So the title of my talk is Rapidly Responding to COVID-19 Using Knowledge Graphs. And so I work with Pedro in the Center on Knowledge Graphs, and we are thinking about different ways we can use the knowledge that we find in these knowledge graphs to solve the problems we have. So let's look at two pressing questions that we have in our current times. So question number one, let's say you are, you're working on pharmaceuticals research, or you're a medical professional who's trying to determine which cures are promising. And you have 5 different options. And Pedro just explained how a knowledge graph could capture all of the different literature about different chemicals and different drugs, and whether where they've been mentioned in articles in the literature treating or somehow affecting coronavirus. So now the question is, you have all of these papers that Pedro's knowledge graph returned. Which results do you trust? Because there are many, many, many papers. You can't read all of them. You can't try everything. So the first question we want to use a knowledge graph to answer is, can we better understand which scientific research is going to be reproducible, that you can trust those results, so that then you don't waste your time on cures that might not work. The second question is completely different. It's a very different kind of problem, but let's say you need a mask. And so everyone needs masks, and now you have a plan to build a mask, but you can't do it yourself. You can build maybe like some part of the fabric, and you need those elastic straps. How do you find the people who make the elastic straps? So if you want to make a mask, how can you find the people who will help you manufacture those masks? And as I said, that's a very different question, but both of these questions we're going to solve with knowledge graphs. So these are actually relevant to 2 research problems that we study in my research teams. So the first one, as I mentioned, is which scientific studies are reproducible? How can we automatically determine, using the knowledge that we have in the knowledge graph, the most probable studies that will be reproducible, that if you try to run the experiments in the study again, you'll get the same result. And this is actually a crisis that many people are facing, where you try to reproduce the result and you don't get the same effects, and as a result, that time is wasted and you're not able to actually use the result. The second question we study is, how do businesses interoperate? How do they compete against each other? How do they partner together? Who are their customers? What do they patent? How do those patents change hands? So all of these things are important to businesses in the US. And what we want to do is understand all of that, so that when a partnership is necessary, or some sort of customer-client relationship is necessary, we understand how those operate and can suggest the people to talk to. And so the underlying research projects I'm going to talk about today that are driven by knowledge graphs, the first one is called MacroScore. This is a big DARPA project here at ISI. And what we want to do is build a knowledge graph about papers. This is slightly different from the knowledge graph about scientific literature that Pedro described, because it's much more focused on understanding the exact claims that the paper makes, the experiments that support those claims, as well as the information about that experiment, such as the protocol used, the population it studied, the dependent and independent variables, and the results. And so you can understand why it's very important to understand the experiment if you want to determine whether that experiment is reproducible. And in order to do that, we're collecting many different features, which I'll talk about in a moment, about these publications and about the people who write these publications. The second project is called the Business Open Knowledge Network. And in the Business Open Knowledge Network, we're trying to study this question of how companies interoperate. So it might be that Apple and Samsung compete against each other making mobile devices, but Apple and Dell compete against each other when making personal computers, and Apple competes with Pandora and Spotify in terms of music services. And it might be that Warner Music supplies both Pandora and Spotify with music, and so if we know that Apple is competing against them, we can understand that maybe Warner Music is a potential supplier to Apple. And so these are sorts of examples of interoperation between these companies. And if we understand this network of who supplies who competes against who, and who buys from who, we can then understand how, if you want to create a new mask, who you could talk to get the supplies you need. And so the reason we care about these knowledge graphs is that knowledge graphs have really taken force as a way of actually accessing knowledge. So if you use Siri, Alexa, or Google Assistant, underlying the system, the answers it gives you is a knowledge graph. Or if you type queries into Google these days, what it's doing is accessing a knowledge graph, which has structured knowledge about sports scores, the players, information about the teams. If you get in a car crash, the insurance adjuster is going to use a knowledge graph to basically understand what happened and figure out who's at fault. And even if you're looking for photos of your friends, underlying the social network is a knowledge graph, which describes the relationships between people and sort of the artifacts that pertain to them. So knowledge graphs have really kind of taken off as the means by which we understand and access knowledge. And we want to use them for these sorts of rapid response problems where you have a crisis and you want to very quickly access that knowledge and turn it into useful conclusions. So let me first talk about MacroScore, which is our project to identify reproducible research. So I've listed some of the faculty at USC who work on this project: Christina Lerman, Fred Morstatter, and Shang Ren. So their labs and the students and postdocs they work with have been instrumental in all of these, and I'll point out their actual contributions going forward. So the MacroScore project is part of this DARPA SCORE program, and it was initially designed to understand reproducibility and replicability in social and behavioral sciences research. And the approach that we've taken involves taking a set of claims and then trying to understand things at the article level as well as at the network level and putting it into a knowledge graph. And so let me dive a little deeper into what that means. So the key idea is that you have a paper, and the first thing we're going to do is put that paper under the microscope. And so we're going to look at features of these specific studies from the scientific articles. And so some of these sorts of things are like sample size that were brought up earlier. The second thing we're going to do is look at all of the related literature, the works that cite this paper, the works this paper cites, information about the authors, potential social network mentions of the research. And then we're going to put all of it together in a large knowledge graph. And using that knowledge graph, we're going to apply AI models. And those AI models will allow us to determine the patterns that look like good research and the patterns that look like bad research and turn them into a score. And then finally, we're going to provide an explanation to make sure that everybody can understand why we think this paper is a good paper or a bad paper. And in that, try to make sure that there's nothing that can be gamed. So, one initial result we've seen is that if you add a female co-author, your score goes up. And that's the sort of thing that, you could imagine once it gets out, people just start adding co-authors to make their paper seem better than it is. So these sorts of things are manipulable, whereas other things such as the quality of your work are not. So the first step, this micro-level extraction, this is being done by Shang Ren. And the NLP systems he's using allow us to understand the choices that the researchers made when they conducted the study. So one example of this choice is the sample size. How many participants were in the study? Another is the modeling approach. So here you can see that they used hierarchical regression models to understand this result. And then we also have the effect size and significance as measured by the p-value. So is this a large effect, and how significant is the effect according to a statistical test? And so we're able to take NLP models, annotate a set of documents, and then test how well we are able to extract from scientific articles things like the models that were used or the tests and studies undertaken, sample sizes, effect sizes, and p-values. So as you can see, some of these are very easy. So the models, if you have a very limited set of models, you can be pretty good at finding them. Although if you don't know about a model, it's kind of hard to find. Everyone kind of refers to p-values in the same way, so that's very easy to find. But for effect sizes and sample sizes, there's a lot of variation. So we're doing sort of okay, but as we continue to improve, these numbers are going to go up. The second part of the input to the knowledge graph is a macro level analysis. So we want to understand the relationship between a study and the full research community. So who is the paper citing? Who is citing this paper? Are those citations within the same subdiscipline or sub-area, or do they reach across multiple disciplines and multiple sort of areas of research? So the COVID-19 data set that Pedro mentioned is under 50,000 papers. But once you start looking at the network around that, you have nearly 1 million papers. So you have a much larger field to understand the context of this research. And so we can create these graphs where you have a paper and the references it makes to other papers, as well as the citations it receives from papers that already exist. We can use that to make predictions about how significant the paper is. And so you can see here is a graph where we took some of these features that we got from this graph about the papers, and we're able to make some predictions about how significant the results would be. So as I said, all of these things are going into a knowledge graph, and that knowledge graph captures the papers, the people involved with the papers, the organizations they belong to, the experiments that were undertaken, the variables in those experiments, and a lot of derived features, like features from the network, such as the centrality of the paper, the number of the in degree or out degree, which is related to the number of citations, or even something like PageRank, like the algorithm used to determine how important a paper is in a Google search is also used to determine how important a paper might be in the scientific literature. You can do the same thing for people. So using these features, we have this very sort of expansive knowledge graph about the work that's being done. And so what we can do now is run queries on this knowledge graph to test hypotheses about what sort of research is most likely to be reproducible, replicable, and high quality. So one example is that we could run this query, which is fairly long, but what it does, it finds two authors who cite each other separately, but have never co-authored a paper together. So they're citing each other sort of theoretically because they both think each other does great work, but they've never actually worked together. So it's not just because they have some vested interest in citing each other's papers. And so this sort of graph here shows you the authors, the papers that they write, and then the papers that sort of the cited authors write, and shows the kind of links between them. And so we can show here the sort of an interpretable graph of exactly which authors we believe to be kind of doing good research and having kind of legitimate citations rather than citing themselves or citing their friends. So once we have all of this knowledge in the knowledge graph, we can do some modeling. So this is the work of Fred Morstatter, and he is using deep learning approaches to find patterns in the citation graph of the authors and papers that we believe are reproducible. So these deep learning approaches generally take the network, remove some of the information in the network, and then try to predict it back. And by doing that, they learn a lot about how the network is actually structured and are able to represent sort of at a abstract level the patterns within the network. And so in these results, there are several different sources of data. So the Web of Science or the Microsoft Academic Graph that we evaluate, as well as citation types, whether they're references or citations. And so using these different types of inputs, as well as using different types of features, including those that can be manually computed, we tried several different classifiers to be able to determine what is reproducible and what is not. And so we did this for a non-COVID research corpus because we don't have great annotation. So that's where these results are. We used something that we trained on a different corpus on the core data set. And so looking at the results of things that were predicted non-replicable, Fred found that some of these were sort of naturopathy, so sort of non-scientific or sort of more informal or homeopathic types of remedies. Some of the non-replicable studies relied heavily on social network analysis, and that obviously can be very tricky to do and is hard to reproduce depending on your network and the data you collect. And the last category were industry-sponsored studies about specific things that a company was putting out more or less like a scientific press release with a little bit of experimental evidence. So this suggests that what we're doing is sort of on the right track, that we are finding things that are poor quality of research. And one of the papers that we predicted as non-replicable was actually later retracted. So we do have a good sense that we're able to figure this out. So the last thing that MacroScore does is provide explanations. And the goal of these explanations is to basically take the domain knowledge that experts have when they assess research, the people who write journal reviews, and capture it in a way that somebody would understand very quickly. So we have some of these intuitive visualizations. So this is a Venn diagram, and it has 3 classes: studies with small sample sizes, studies with small effect sizes, and studies with a high number of self-citations. And these little stars are different papers, and the goal is that you'd be able to click on one of these stars and see sort of a summary of the paper. And we have a prototype that's working with this. And then once you kind of looked at the paper, it would give you some information about what we expect, whether it is replicable or not, and then give you some reasons why it thinks this study is replicable. So in this case, because this paper has a large sample size and it has a large sort of statistical power. And so this is sort of our vision for responding to scientific reproducibility. And as I said, all of these things are working on a corpus of social and behavioral sciences and achieving good results. And we've also retooled all of that infrastructure for COVID-19. And for COVID-19, we don't have the same level of evaluation data, but informally we found that some of these tools are very helpful. So now I'm going to move on to the next sort of area, which is this business knowledge graph that captures the relationships between businesses. And we're calling that the Business Open Knowledge Network. It's a project funded by NSF. And so this is actually a collaboration between people at USC who are computer scientists and people across the country at USC, the University of Maryland, and Dartmouth who are in business schools. So they're professors at business school. And we've recently started working with Benil Starley, who is an expert on manufacturing at North Carolina State University. And so together, we're trying to understand how these relationships can help us very quickly create supply chains and manufacturing networks to respond to the needs that have popped up. So, I started out with this question of, let's say you want to make a mask, who can help you? In order to actually answer that question, you need to know the expertise of different companies. You need to know how to substitute materials or substitute components when something is unavailable, which is happening more and more. And then you want to find new supply chains. You want to find the manufacturers who interact, the material suppliers who interact. And often if there's a disruption in shipping or your sourcing of components, you have to find people who can jump in and fill those gaps. And last, since things have changed so dramatically, there are lots of people who have great expertise, but are on the sidelines, small manufacturers, small businesses, and you want to make them feel empowered and engaged to say, oh yeah, I can help and I have ways of helping. So what we'd like to do is find businesses that might not have a formal mechanism of collaborating and reach out to them and get them involved. So the way we've been approaching this project is we're trying to learn all about companies using all of the information that's available on the World Wide Web. And so that includes many different types of information that you can find. Some of this information is web pages. So information that the company has put on the web on their website. Some of it is market data that you can get from many different providers. Public companies often have regulatory filings, so you can look at those just by going to the SEC website, for example. Companies also find patents. So when they file a patent, they describe their technological contributions and what they mean. And then some of these are sort of countrywide or zip code wide economic indicators where we can understand things that are sort of at the level of economic output in different regions or different states. So what we'd like to do is put all of this data together in a knowledge graph and learn from it in a deep way. And so the approaches we use include language models and machine learning systems that read the text, as well as some expert knowledge where these documents from SEC filings are broken up and segmented into the part that really talks about the business output, and then we use words from that. So one of the problems you have with all of this data is that you have to be able to basically link it across these sources. So you might have Apple's website, you might have Apple's web regulatory filings, and you might have Apple's patents. And what you really need to know is that these are all the same Apple. And so one of the nice things is that we have a set of tools, both developed at ISI, as well as some that are kind of publicly available, that allow us to find these entity names, these sort of companies, and then resolve them or link them across different sources. So we can understand all of this information is about the same thing, about Apple, the company. So together, we've built this business open knowledge network, and we have entity resolution, which allows us to translate between all of the different data sources. All of the tools we're developing, we're going to release under open APIs, so everyone can access this. As you might imagine, business-related knowledge is extremely competitive. Many companies make a lot of money by selling this, and we're trying to make this publicly available. And finally, we're going to use machine learning systems on terabytes and terabytes of data. So we have web pages, we have historical snapshots of web pages for 20 years, as well as regulatory filings, patents. So that's a lot of data. And so we put all of that data and we build this knowledge graph. And as I said, it captures things like competition and different types of competition. So as I was saying earlier, Apple and Samsung compete in the mobile device market, and they're both supplied by Foxconn. Samsung and Microsoft might compete in a similar kind of mobile device market, while IBM and Microsoft compete in a services market. And so you can understand these different relationships of competition, supplies, or partnerships, then you can understand exactly how these sorts of systems interoperate. So one of the problems is that sometimes what we need is missing. So we can actually use probabilistic models where we can write these sort of rules that get turned into probabilistic system and then turn that into new knowledge or new predictions that improve our knowledge graph. So let me quickly walk you through some of the results that we get here. So we can type in a specific idea that we have, like chemical vapor deposition for personal protective equipment manufacturing. And our system will tell you what companies are most relevant to that process. And if you click on this company, Industrial Aero, it'll give you a little profile about that. Now, if you went to Google and you put that same phrase into Google, it wouldn't be that useful. This is a research group at UC Santa Cruz. This is OSHA requirements. This is sort of a brochure. This is a Wikipedia article. So this is not going to get you to companies. It's going to be kind of annoying to find the knowledge you need, whereas our system actually finds you companies and gives you a profile of those companies. So we're using knowledge from Open Corporates, which is a supplier of open information as well. So within this, within our system, we provide a network of companies. So from our collaborators at NC State, we got a list of manufacturers that are important, and when we put those into our system, we get a set of related manufacturers. So Sealing Devices is a manufacturer we got from NC State, and when we put it into our system, we see a bunch of other companies like Sealing Specialties, Munico Sealing, and Great Lakes Rubber. And if you were to click on Great Lakes Rubber, we're going to allow you to interactively see the network around Great Lakes Rubber. So we can see the other companies that are related to Great Lakes Rubber and a little profile of Great Lakes Rubber. along with some URLs. So this is a nice way to be able to explore the companies that you would need to help you manufacture what the product that you want to make. So our system has nearly 1 million companies, or I guess over 1 million companies in it currently, and all of them have sort of links to other companies. And in many cases, we can find this profile information about the company that gives us some more facts and allows us to understand the business of that company. And so hopefully looking at the Business Open Knowledge Network, you kind of understand how it can help you find the expertise of companies, learning about substitutions or other related companies, finding new supply chains, and engaging smaller businesses or businesses that can just put in a few keywords about what they do and find the people who are related to them, who they could help or who could help them. So to wrap up, I described how these two different knowledge graphs in very different ways support COVID-19 response. One by understanding high quality research, and the other by looking at the interoperation of companies in order to manufacture novel products or quickly change supply chains. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Jay. So let us take a few questions. Okay, our first question is, when does knowledge extracted from a knowledge graph gets republished or verified? And are there any examples from music sharing?
Yeah, I don't know that I fully understand that question, but let me try to answer what I think is the intent of that question means. So there are two types of knowledge that are in this knowledge graph. Some of it is just factual. So if you see that a paper cites another paper, then that sort of information is usually fairly reliable. Maybe there's some question of identifying the right paper, and so that's sort of factual knowledge. Some of the other knowledge is derived. So for example, you can see these dotted arrows where we're making a prediction that Apple competes against Pandora based on information we have about Apple and Pandora. There's no source of truth that definitively could tell us, do they compete? What does compete mean? So in some cases, you have to make an ontological statement that you have a confidence in, but depending on the actual rigorous definition may or may not be accurate. And so in these cases, when we verify things or we try to evaluate, do Apple and Pandora compete, we try a few different things, one of which is we look at standard industry classifications and see if they belong to the same industry. Another is that we look at whether the profitability of the competing companies is close to it better predicts the profitability of the sort of the people in their network than just the average of the industry class. And often that's a good signal from the business perspective.
So Jay, maybe I can add something here. So one of the benefits of the knowledge graphs is that in addition to publishing the statements, you can publish justifications for the statements. And those are carried over with the knowledge graph. So people who consume the statements can see the justifications and decide if they want to trust or not trust the fact base or the statement based on the justification. And so if a statement is, the justification is that this is data published by the World Bank, that's one thing. If the justification is this is data that we extracted with a machine reading system and the confidence of the extraction is 0.5, then you can sort of, act accordingly.
Correct. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And next question is, what aspect of Google search is used in slide 11?
I imagine this is a slide, what aspect of Google search. So in this, let me just double check that there's no Google search on slide 11. No. Okay, so just to kind of clarify what I meant here, right? So our system allows you to basically type in, it's designed for a business plan. So you can just sort of type in a business plan or a business need here and hit submit. And then you get a a sort of network of companies related to this business plan. And one of the reasons we're building the tool this way is that if you go and you type those same keywords in Google, you don't actually get related businesses. You get a lot of other kind of information about your technique, but not really the kind of business network. And so this is one of the problems, is that if you actually wanted to understand, who would help me with chemical vapor deposition for manufacturing, Google's not going to tell you. You really need a custom resource that understands businesses and what they do. Naturopathy, so those are basically like herbal remedies or natural remedies. Those are the types of things that are not scientifically vetted. And so often, if somebody says you should take, magnesium, or you could drink some bleach to cure, COVID-19, that is not a scientific result. It might just be something that, like an herbal remedy or something that is informally defined, and sometimes that shows up in the literature.
Got it. And the next question is, how do you deal with the redundancies in the name of the companies? And are the 1 million companies included in the business open knowledge network in the US?
So the redundancies in the name of company, so that's actually a big problem in entity resolution, which is the technique I described. And so we have a set of normalizations to remove things like ink, or kind of determine what is most useful and what's least useful. So often if you see first, or second, those numbers can be less relevant because they appear in many, many names, whereas, bank is maybe more important sometimes. So first and bank is more important than just first or bank alone. The million companies are primarily US companies. We got a database of US companies and crawled their web pages. In some cases, when they have international arms or international locations, we have also gotten some of their web page data just on the basis of that crawl, and sometimes that pops up in our system.
Okay, thanks, Ray. And the next question is, can your business open knowledge network system be used to identify what companies might be interested in engaging in collaboration with USC research groups or licensing of USC's inventions?
Yes, so that's something we're trying to do. We have all of the patent filings downloaded, and we're trying to apply the same techniques to understand patent filings. So once you have the patent filing, our hope is that you would be able to take, for example, your lab's webpage, put it into our system, and find sort of the patents that are most related. And then you could say, if somebody was interested in commercialization, they could say, okay, here's the related work in the area, here's the gap, and here's how you could commercialize something to fill that gap. So I think that would be one great way to help commercialize technologies, both from academia as well as from sort of entrepreneurs and small.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And the last question is, can we have a dynamic Bayesian network out of knowledge graph to tell which paper is more significant given the knowledge base and the dependency amongst nodes?
Yeah, so the model that I showed here that's producing these explanations is actually very close to, it's a different type of probabilistic graphical model we're using called probabilistic soft logic. And so in probabilistic soft logic, you can use a similar type of architecture as a dynamic Bayesian network. You have a set of basically potentials that capture the dependencies between different features in the papers and the claims. And you can then use those features as ways of predicting the reproducibility. And then you can also capture the dependencies between papers and citations in that model. So it's a great idea. And I think we're already kind of working on one technique that's similar to that. But I think DBNs would be another technique that would show promise.
Right. Okay, thanks, Ray. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. All right, folks, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We'll post the slides in our websites, so you can go and check cci.usc.edu to find the slides and also the presentation video from today's talk. And I presume the video will also be available in USC Viterbi's YouTube channel. Please watch out for next week's webinar announcement, and we'll meet again next week, Friday.
Yeah, let me just add that we're actually going to skip next week simply because there's a competing seminar on AI for COVID-19. And so that's an all-day webinar that'll be next Friday, but then we'll resume the following week.
All right. Yeah, thanks. Perfect. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks
Bye.
everyone for joining.